Hello, I'm Roz Atkins. Welcome to World Have Your Say. We're going to talk about Syria today. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said the situation there resembles a civil war. And however we choose to describe it, what's beyond discussion is that President Assad, the UN and the Arab League have pressing decisions to take on how to resolve this conflict. You're also reacting to comments from the Turkish government, which has said it believes Syria is being ignored because of a relative lack of wealth. We'll hear if you agree with that. We're live for the whole hour on BBC World News. You can email us, text us, get in touch on Google Plus and on Facebook. And of course, wherever you're watching in the world, you can call as well. We're looking forward to speaking to you. Well, we've got waiting to speak to you in Egypt, in the UK and also in Lebanon. You can tweet me directly during the show at BBC Roz Atkins or just use the WHYS hashtag. First things first, though, let's look at all the main news of the day, starting in Burma, where pro-democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi says she will stand for elections to parliament. It's an apparent endorsement of the reforms being made by the government there, as her NLD party boycotted the last polls in November 2010. The French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé says the Syrian authorities aren't willing to implement reform and that tougher sanctions are needed now. Syria, meanwhile, has agreed in principle to let an Arab League mission into the country. Italy's lower house has given the new Prime Minister, Mario Monti, an overwhelming vote of confidence by voting through his austerity measures to deal with Italy's budget crisis. The upper house had already passed them. Sri Lanka's former army chief, Sarath Fonseca, has been sentenced to 3 years in jail. He was found guilty of making false allegations of war crimes against the government. His lawyer has said he will appeal. And the head of FIFA, Sepp Blatter, has apologised for suggesting that racism on the pitch could be settled with a handshake at the end of the match. He told the BBC he regretted the comments and is still hurting over the scandal. Let me introduce you to our first guest. Live with us from Lebanon is Bashir Khoder, spokesman for the Free Patriotic Movement, which is part of the Lebanese government. In Cairo, we have Najib Kadbarian, a member of the Syrian Opposition Consultative Council. And live from Ankara is Yasser Yakis, a former Turkish foreign minister and also previously councillor at the Turkish embassy in Damascus. He still is an MP serving in Turkey. All three of you are very welcome to the programme. Perhaps I could start with you, Bashir Khoder, in Lebanon. How would you like the watching world to deal with the situation in Syria?
It's obvious that there is a serious problem right now in Syria, but the way the whole world is dealing with the situation is very bad for the Syrian people, I can see, because they are pushing it for a real civil war. They did not give the President Bashar al-Assad a real chance to show the reforms that he worked on, and the situation is going to stay the way it is. In Lebanon, we are very afraid of a civil war that may happen in Syria because the very next day it's going to start in Lebanon.
And so, because your line isn't as good as it might be, let me just reiterate, you're saying you have grave concerns this could develop into a civil war, something the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already suggested is happening. And you say President Assad has not been given a chance to show that he can reform. I wonder, Yasser Yakis in Ankara, whether you agree with that.
Well, I don't agree with that because Bashar Assad was given all chances to take steps in the direction of making democratic reforms and letting people having heard their voice, and this was promised to the Turkish foreign minister when he visited there and when he had a very long talk with him, and he promised similar things to the Arab League as well, and nothing came out. It was too slow, and nothing concrete was found. So I don't think that he was not given a chance to respond. He was given a chance, but he did not use this chance, in my opinion.
So you say he's had ample time to reform and now further action is necessary. Najib in Cairo, let's bring you in. Do you think more time should be given to President Assad?
Absolutely not. He had all the time he wanted. He had 11 years to introduce any meaningful reform, and he has not done so. But to comment on your guest from Lebanon, he's talking the Syrian people want. Well, the Syrian people want regime change by peaceful means. This is why they've been taking to the street for 8 months now, and they've been doing it, demanding nothing but a comprehensive regime change. We want a regime that transforms the country from a security apparatus state and family mafia-like state regime into a civil democratic state. So I think the persistence and the continuation of the regime is pushing the country into a civil war. And therefore, I think the way out is for this regime to step down, for Bashar himself to step down. And I think international pressure is needed to bring that result.
We'll talk about international pressure and what form that might take in a moment. As you were talking, we were seeing pictures of anti-Assad rallies in Istanbul. It's worth adding, though, and we'll play you the pictures of this a little later in World Have Your Say. We also have footage of pro-Assad rallies taking place in the Syrian capital, Damascus. But let's talk about that international pressure, because after all, it's Turkey, more than perhaps any country in the world, which has pushed for further international pressure. Yasir Yakis with us live from Turkey. What form should that pressure take? Sanctions, military action? What do you suggest?
No, the military action should be last thing to be resorted to. All the other options should be exhausted before doing so. So without pushing the country into a chaos. This may be pressure, isolation in the international community, and perhaps then may come sanctions, but the sanctions should be managed in such a way that it should not harm the Syrian people, it should harm perhaps the rulers, the regime, more than the people.
And as I was mentioning in the news, the French Foreign Secretary Alain Juppé has come out saying stronger sanctions are necessary. For the moment, we've said goodbye to Bahir in Lebanon. Let's bring in my colleague Rami, who's with us, Rami Ruhayem, who's the BBC's Arab Affairs analyst. Before we talk about further sanctions, Rami, let's at least remind ourselves of what sanctions are already in place against the Syrians.
Economic sanctions and also sanctions targeting personalities in the Syrian regime have already been announced. The EU has its own sanctions, and the United States has also its own sanctions. Turkey has spoken a lot about sanctions. They've stopped joint oil projects with the Syrians, and they've threatened to stop exporting electricity as well to the Syrians. We've already heard of some of the effects of these sanctions in terms of fuel shortages, but so far it appears that the government of President Bashar al-Assad until the moment has not felt the bite strongly enough to either change its behavior or to begin to show signs of crumbling or falling down.
Rami, thank you very much indeed. As you're talking, I can see that calls are coming in from Zambia, Nigeria, New Zealand, Norway, Saudi Arabia, Mauritius, Bangladesh, Gambia and India. If you're watching wherever you are in the world, we're live here on World Have Your Say. We're talking about Syria, and your contributions and analysis are certainly welcome. You can call us up. We'll call you back if you come on air. The number's country code 44 2070 83 72 72, or tweet us or email us letting us know that you'd like to come on air. We'll get back to you. And if we don't actually speak to you on the air, many of your comments will end up on the screen next to me. Now let's bring in Osama, who we found on Twitter. He's a Syrian living in the UK. And I know, Osama, you have spent a great deal of time in Damascus recently. What's your analysis of what's happening there?
I think people now are really, really worried about sanctions. They weren't really affected when the demonstrators were happening, because they were only happening on Fridays during an hour slot just after Friday prayer. But now I feel that my family and a lot of people are all Syrians are going to be affected by sanctions. I think we need to think strong and hard before the international community takes such a measure, because it will not only affect Syria, but it will also affect the neighboring countries. I know I went to Beirut and I spoke to people there, and they've also said to me that once the demonstrations happened, that their business has gone down approximately 40%. So imagine what sanctions could do, and imagine let alone war. So I think people now are really, really worried about sanctions. I think if you gave them the choice, they would prefer that we wait and see what the Arab Initiative does, rather than full-on sanctions, because there's no way back from it. And from experience, we know that sanctions hasn't really brought any regime down, but affected the people instead.
Okay, well, I think, yes, I could understand that people are, concerned about sanctions, but 2 points. First, the sanctions have targeted so far members of the regime, and I think those are kind of smart sanctions, and in fact, more can be done in terms of pursuing the assets of the Assad family, particularly Makhlouf, who still has a lot of investment in Gulf countries. Secondly, really the most urgent issues now regarding Syria is the question of protecting civilians who are killed on a daily basis. Since the Arab Initiative was introduced, more than 500 people were killed, and the Arab Initiative focuses on stopping the killing, the repression, pulling out tanks from the street, and engaging the opposition in a dialogue. So, I mean, they never stopped the killing while they accepted the initiative. So to us, the most urgent issues is, putting more pressure, diplomatic, economic, taking the issue to the Security Council in order to, bring that kind of pressure to allow international monitors, so we could, go into protecting civilians who are practicing their basic rights, even under the Assad constitution, to peacefully protest. So that's, to us, the most important issue.
Thank you very much for those comments, Najib. Osama, I'm curious to ask you just quickly, do you not look at what's happened in Libya and feel, I would like that for my country?
Like what?
Like support from the international community to restrict the actions of the country's army, like a coordinated opposition movement which eventually seizes power and pushes the leader aside?
Personally, I don't want force to be taken for regime change. I think it should be done through elections. A lot of people disagree with me. This is probably unpopular, but it will save a lot of lives. It will save a lot of infrastructure. And it will make sure that because there's two sides to this, not just one side. I've seen two sides to this. Believe it or not, there's people who like the regime, whether you like it or not. There's people who do, and the only way to find that out is through elections, because what we don't want to happen is a revolution now. Let's force this revolution, and then there's going to be more people that dislike the revolution, and there'll be a revolution after that.
All right, so you've expressed a number of concerns there, Osama. Those of you watching who are supporting what the opposition is doing in Syria, how would you address the concerns that Osama raises? By all means, call us up, country code 44 2070 83 72 72. I will also add, if you're wondering, where is the Syrian government contributor to this program? In the last 48 hours, World Have Your Say has approached the Syrian Information Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, an advisor to President Assad, the embassy in London, the embassy in Washington, and the Syrian mission at the UN in New York. And for a variety of reasons, none of those places were able to offer a guest. Now, we're going to take a couple of minutes break here on World Have Your Say, but we'll be back and we'll be live continuing our conversations about Libya. Hi, I'm Ross Atkins. Thanks for joining me on World Have Your Say. Contrary to what I said just before the break, we're talking about Syria, of course, and not Libya. The situation there is becoming ever more delicate. Yesterday, we heard from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying the scenes in Syria now resemble a civil war. And however we want to describe it, certainly it's pressing. And for President Assad, the Arab League and the UN, there are some pressing decisions to be taken. We're hearing what decisions you would like to see them take. By all means, call us up, country code 44 2070 83 72 72. And before we bring in our guests again, let me tell you what Captain Amar El-Wawi told me on World Have Your Say earlier. He's an officer with the Free Syria Army. He used to work for the Syrian army, but he defected. He only spoke Arabic, but this is part of what he told us. We've written it up because the clip you wouldn't be able to understand. He said there's no civil war This is a scarecrow created by the regime. All of Syria is demonstrating, and I have not seen any banners of a sectarian nature. We support every move that helps the people. Well, let's pick up some of those issues with the three guests who are with us. Osama, a Syrian living in the UK. Rami, the BBC's Arab Affairs analyst who's live with us in central London. And Najib Gadbian, who's a member of the Syrian Opposition Consultative Council. He's live from Cairo, and I should also mention he's a professor of politics at the University of Arkansas. Najib and Rami, let me ask you, Najib first, are you concerned about sectarian divisions that could emerge if President Assad stood down?
The ambassador.
Actually, I'm concerned about sectarian division if Bashar stays in power. The regime has been pushing towards sectarian strife in the country, and the demonstrators, on the other hand, have been demanding all the times, emphasizing national unity, emphasizing non-sectarian discourse, and therefore we believe the further the regime uses violence, repression, there's likely of the country slipping into that. But I want to comment on the foreign ministers of Russia's comments, actually. I think there's an exaggeration there, and we do believe that, like the most of the international community reached the conclusion that this regime is lost its legitimacy, is not able to handle the crisis, and must go. So I think, again, we believe that this is the job of the Syrian people to do that, but international pressure, international support, taking the issue to the Security Council again to at least condemn the use of violence, take some of the regime's criminals into the ICC. All of those, I think, are going to hasten the fall of this regime, which is imminent.
Okay, so you're critical of what Sergei Lavrov had to say. Let's also, though, stick to the sectarian issue. Rami, come in here. For people who don't know Syrian society well, can you explain how sectarian divisions manifest themselves in Syria?
Well, they've been kept under a tight lid for the past few decades, but the way they manifest themselves now is in sectarian violence, unfortunately. Yesterday, there was a statement from Burhan Ghalioun, who is the leader of the Syrian National Council, the most prominent opposition council so far, warning and issuing an impassioned plea for supporters of the opposition to refrain from engaging in any acts of sectarian violence. Now, we've been hearing talk of sectarian violence from pro-regime sides so far, and obviously their motive in talking about this is to say it's either us or chaos. But when this talk comes from the opposition in the form of this plea to the opposition supporters, then we know that in Homs, which Burhan Ghalioun mentioned specifically, there has been some sectarian violence going on. Yes, we do see banners in the opposition protests saying no to sectarianism, and the opposition is trying to say that this is not a sectarian movement, despite the fact that the regime is a minority Alawi regime as opposed to the Sunni majority in the country. But the nature of sectarian conflict is that it spins out of control, and whoever is responsible for the beginning of sectarian conflict becomes quickly irrelevant in terms of what's going on the ground.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Rami. By the way, if you're watching and have questions for Rami, by all means tweet them in using the WHYS hashtag or email worldhaveyoursay@bbc.com. I can see we've had calls from Trinidad and Tobago and Australia. We'll try and get as many of you on the air as we can. If we don't manage it, we've also got World Have Your Say Extra, which is on air in about 3 hours' time, and you're welcome to take part in that as well. Let's bring in Ziad, who joins us on the phone. He's a Syrian living in Michigan in the States. Ziad, what's your comment?
With regards to what subject? I got introduced into this as whoever was speaking was just finishing up a point.
Well, I suppose my question to you would be, as someone in America, how would you like President Obama to approach the situation in Syria?
Hands off Syria. Simple as that. The United States does not need any more conflicts or adventures around the world. Syria is a very powerful country militarily. It's not Libya. It will drag us into some horribly dissipating kind of conflict, and we don't need that.
So America should stay out, but does that mean everyone should stay out, or would you just rather that the French and the Turks took the lead?
The French, who have a very bad record with us, should stay out of Syria completely. They are despised in Syria. If they want to send their one aircraft carrier over there, we have enough Yakout missiles to sink them. I don't think they want that either. So I don't expect any kind of intervention by foreign powers at all in Syria. It's a different situation, and we are ready. I mean, Syria, we are ready as a people to defend that country. And whether these, I just heard the last part of Mr. I think Abdulrahman's remarks. The fact of the matter is, I'm opposed to any concessions to these dissidents and these defectors. I think the army should take care of them and finish them off once and for all. As a person who knows many secular Sunnis, and the Sunnis are the majority true in Syria, they are opposed. They're opposed to these criminals, and they want them finished off. And I wish the president would just finish them off once and for all.
Thank you very much for getting in touch, Ziad. You say the people who are calling themselves opposition are criminals. You say Syrians are ready to defend themselves if any other country tries to interfere in its affairs. If you're watching in Syria or America, would like to respond, country code 44 2070 83 72 72. I'd like to go back to Najib in Cairo. Najib, if you heard that call from Ziad, what's your response?
Well, this is the logic, the discourse of a disparate regime that's going to be out of power very soon. This is the same language we heard from Gaddafi in his last days when he threatened Europe, threatened the whole world of insecurity. And actually Assad did the same thing. This is why we have not seen a genuine dialogue in Syria. We have not seen genuine reform in Syria because of that mentality. For us, we do believe that there are some people who might be close and concerned about this regime. And the way to decide that, as an earlier caller said, is through the ballot box. But this regime has not allowed that. This is why we call for regime change. This regime change entails changing the rules of the game so everybody can contest peacefully for the people's vote. And so this is the opposition. If somebody says that does not make this person a criminal. So again, I think it's a sign of desperation. This regime is falling, and we want to do it with the least cost in terms of human lives and in terms of infrastructure.
And there will be some people watching going, well, hold on, there are elections in Syria. We'll get Rami to talk about their exact nature in a moment. But first of all, let's bring in Ben from the World Have Your Say team, who's with everyone who's answering your calls as they come in. What are we hearing, Ben?
Well, I can see calls on the screen behind me coming in from Thailand, Qatar and Portugal at the moment. I was just chatting to Ivry, who called in from Tel Aviv. He said Assad should be deposed, but it should be a matter for the Syrian people. And that is a common theme amongst the calls we're getting in, that Syrians should make this decision themselves. Abu Dakar from India called to say we should let Syrians decide their future. For now, Assad should step down. If anyone at all steps in, it should be the Arab world. And the other theme in some of our calls is alleging hypocrisy on the part of those countries saying that Assad should step down. Adil in India called to say this: why are Muslim countries always facing pressure and no Israel? Syria should be left alone.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. The number to call if you want to speak to Ben and the rest of the team, country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Rami, let's bring you in here because there is some disagreement amongst our viewers about the nature of Syrian democracy. Can we even call Syria a democracy?
We certainly cannot call Syria a democracy. Just having elections does not mean a country is a democracy. You need free debate, you need the freedom and the ability to form parties, to contest power. You need a free press for a democracy. This does not mean that President Assad does not have popularity. We don't know what kind of popularity he has. It's very difficult to find out in the current circumstances or in the circumstances even before the revolution. But we cannot call Syria a democracy just because there were elections.
And it's worth adding, Rami, that the World Have Your Say team have been making every effort to get people on the phone or on Skype in Syria who can speak to us. That's proving very difficult at the moment. But if you are watching in Syria or anywhere else in the world, do get involved. You can call us, text us, get in touch on Google+, Facebook or Twitter. We're going to keep on chatting in a couple of minutes' time. Hi, I'm Rosatkins. Good to have your company on today's World Have Your Say. Well, your attention is on Syria and a situation which the Russian foreign minister says resembles a civil war. We're discussing what President Assad, the Arab League and the UN should do to resolve that conflict. And do you support French moves today for stronger sanctions to be introduced right now? I also wonder how you would respond to Syrian opposition calls for a Libya-style no-fly zone. Well, we're live. You can take part on Google+, Facebook and Twitter, as well as getting in touch by email, text, or just calling us up. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Well, we've got guests in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Egypt and in the UK ready to speak to you. You can tweet me directly during the show at BBC Ros Atkins or just use the WHYS hashtag. We'll pick up both. First of all, though, let's look at all of the day's main news. We'll start in Syria. The French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé says the Syrian authorities aren't willing to implement reform and tougher sanctions are now needed. Syria, meanwhile, has agreed in principle to let an Arab League mission into the country. In Burma, the party of pro-democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi says she'll stand for elections to parliament. Now, this is an apparent endorsement of the reforms being made by the government. Her NLD party boycotted the last polls in 2010. Italy's lower house has given the new Prime Minister, Mario Monti, an overwhelming vote of confidence. It's voted through his austerity measures to deal with Italy's budget crisis. The upper house had already passed them. Sri Lanka's former army chief, Sarath Fonseca, has been sentenced to 3 years in jail. He was found guilty of making false allegations of war crimes against the government. His lawyer has said he will appeal. And the head of FIFA, Sepp Blatter, has apologised for suggesting that racism on the pitch could be settled with a handshake at the end of the match. He told the BBC he regretted the comments and is still hurting over the scandal. Let me introduce you to the three guests who'll begin this half hour of World Have Your Say. Pavel Felgenhauer is a defence correspondent for Novaya Gazeta. He's live with us from Moscow. Live from Lebanon is Bakir Khoda, a spokesman for the Free Patriotic Movement, which is part of the Lebanese government. And live from Cairo is the former Egyptian ambassador to France, Tunisia, and the Arab League, Ali Maher. All of you are very welcome on World Have Your Say. Pavel, let me start with you. Do you agree with your government, the Russian government, which says it is a shared responsibility between the opposition and President Assad to resolve this conflict?
Well, I'm not a government spokesman, of course, so I would hardly agree or disagree with them. But I can explain that the Russian government would very much hate to see the Assad regime go. And though Russian capabilities are rather limited to its veto power in the Security Council mostly, but Russia still will do its best to preserve the Assad regime, with which we have long-lasting agreements and good cooperation in a number of fields.
And Ali Maher in Cairo, are you frustrated by the approach of the Chinese and the Russians?
Well, I can understand that they did not follow up the developments in the area. But we who are very near Syria, we who are so much attached with Syria, understand quite well the tragedy that is happening in Syria, the tragedy for the Syrian people, and the huge risks for the region, the huge risks, the impact of all what is happening and what might happen in the next week, in the few next weeks, to all the countries in the area, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, as well as Israel and Egypt. So I am not frustrated, but I think they are more and more coming, these two countries are more and more coming to understand, and that explains how in Moscow the members of the National Syrian Council, the opposition, has been received by the foreign minister. That is an important development.
So you say you're not frustrated. I wonder, those of you watching, are you frustrated by the position of Russia and China, both in their different ways, saying this isn't about applying pressure to President Assad, it's about applying pressure to him and also his opponents. It's a shared responsibility, they say. You can call us up. Let us know if you support that approach. Country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that the two countries pushing for the most strident measures against Syria are Turkey and France. And the French Foreign Minister, Alain Juppé, has been talking about possible routes in the future to act against President Bashar al-Assad. This is what he's had to say.
It's not normal that in a crisis of this magnitude, 3,500 deaths, 20,000 prisoners in Syrian prisons, treated in an extremely brutal manner, tortured, it's not acceptable that the Security Council remains unresponsive. I hope those who block all resolutions of the Security Council will become aware of the reality.
Ali Maher in Cairo, do you agree with what Alain Juppé says.
Well, I think that sanctions, political as well as economic sanctions, should certainly be used because there has been contacts, there have been promises by the Damascus regime which were not upheld. So I think the last meeting of the Arab League in Rabat was very strongly critical of the regime and threatened that if in 3 days' time the government of Syria did not stop the force and the violence against its civilians, then sanctions would be reinforced. And certainly that at a moment or other, we will have to go to the United Nations, to the Security Council, to reinforce these sanctions.
And you're mentioning this 3-day deadline. It's not clear what will happen at the end of that 3-day deadline if the various criteria are not met. It is worth reiterating, though, there is already an Arab League plan that's been agreed. Let's bring in Rami, our Arab affairs analyst here at the BBC, to explain that. Because I'm sure lots of viewers are thinking, hold on, there was a deal with President Assad, but he didn't stick to it. Just remind us about that.
Well, he was supposed to pull his security forces, tanks, armored vehicles from the streets, to release political prisoners and to begin a dialogue with the opposition. He's managed to release a few hundred, little over than 1,000 political prisoners, but obviously he has not implemented the rest of the deal. The Syrian government says it's fighting armed gangs on the streets, which is quite heavily contested by the opposition, which says that the only armed people on the streets are militias which are working for the Assad government, as well as the army defectors who refuse to fire on protesters. But regardless of all of that debate, the Arab League initiative has not been implemented. And at the moment, there are negotiations between Syria and the Arab League over whether the Arab League can send a mission to monitor the implementation of the Arab initiative on the ground.
And I know that a Syrian official spoke to BBC World Service Radio and said, in principle, a mission would be welcome, but don't call it an observation mission because that would undermine Syria's dignity. Thank you very much for the moment, Rami. Remember, if you're watching and have questions about the situation, Rami can help you out. World Have Your Say at bbc.com is the email, or you can post at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. Now, Ali is watching us on BBC World News in Libya, and he's called up. Ali, thank you very much for getting in touch. What's your point?
Well, thank you very much for giving me this chance. I think dictators are just the same. We have experienced Gaddafi for 42 years. When you look at Assad regime, it's about 50 years. I think more pressure on this regime. He will be at the end of the day. He will be out of that region. I think getting rid of such a regime of Assad, the Middle East will be a better off. Lebanon will have its own entity when this regime is out. So I am with putting more pressure on this criminal regime through Turkey. So if there is an intervention, should be through Turkey.
Okay, so that's interesting. You say apply more pressure. That's important, you say, but you say let's do it through Turkey rather than through France or Britain and America. And you say, look what it's done for us. It worked here, it can work in Syria. But Ali Maher, a former Egyptian ambassador to a number of countries, including France, is it a mistake to make direct comparisons with Libya and Syria? They're very different countries, aren't they?
Well, it's a different situation, but then there is that wind of change which has been blowing on the whole area, starting from Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria is part of that setup. My feeling is that it is a matter of time. This regime cannot live much longer after what's happened, after all this killing, all this violence, and we should start worrying about what will happen in the aftermath of the Assad regime, because there are so many risks of friction, so many risks of civil war between different factions, that the Syrian opposition inside and outside Syria should really start building and planning of what will happen when the regime falls, because the regime is bound to fall. It's only a matter of time.
Well, we'll talk about that issue of whether the opposition are coordinating as much as they might be in a minute. Those of you calling in, thank you very much. We're getting an awful lot of calls. Recent countries we've heard from: Qatar, Jordan, Angola, Mali, Canada, Grenada, the Philippines, Jamaica, Sudan and Iraq. We'll do our very best to get as many of you on as we can. If we don't manage it in this hour, World Have Your Say Extra will be back in about 4 hours' time here on BBC World News. You're very welcome to take part in that too. Ali in Libya, thank you for watching and thank you very much indeed for getting back to me. Let's try and speak again to Bahir Kodder, who's a spokesperson for the Free Patriotic Movement, which is part of the Lebanese government. His Skype wasn't too hot a minute ago. We'll try and speak to you again, Bahir. Do you welcome the involvement of Turkey and France in this crisis?
This is really a shame for the Syrian opposition to ask the Ottoman Empire, who occupied one day Syria and Lebanon, other Arab countries, to interfere again in a country like Syria, or even France, who occupied Syria and Lebanon once. I have many points I wanted to answer your other guest, like talking about that the Assad regime is a sectarian regime. The only sectarism I could see in Syria is from the opposition from the very same day when we heard slogans about killing the Alawites and the Christians in Syria. And the Assad regime is not an Alawite regime, it's the Ba'ath regime. Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, but the regime is not Alawite. We can see all the other names in the regime. They are Sunnis or Christians.
Bahir, thank you very much indeed for making those points. And as you were talking, we were seeing some pictures there of President Bashar al-Assad. Before that, we were seeing pictures of Arab League leaders while they were meeting in the Moroccan capital of Rabat. Let's quickly bring in Rami again, just to explain an issue which has been raised a number of times by people emailing in. What are the connections between Syria and Lebanon next door, some of which Bahir touched on there? And there is a fear among some of our viewers that there could be a knock-on effect if this conflict escalates.
Well, it depends how far back in history we should go. Many people argued at the beginning of the century that they are one country, Lebanon and Syria. It's a very big issue, and I won't talk in detail about it, but they are very much organically tied together. Syrian policy in Lebanon has been the single most decisive factor in events in Lebanon, starting in 1976 at the very least, when there was a civil war in Lebanon and when the Syrian army entered Lebanon. Following that, Syrian policy has been very much a decisive factor in Lebanese politics. It's very difficult to imagine what would happen in Lebanon, which is a very sectarian, a very complex country with a sectarian mix as well. If the central government in Syria were to collapse, when analyzing this question, we are looking at a very big number of unknowns. We don't know what will come next in Syria, and we don't know what the relationship of the different parties emerging in Syria in a post-Assad Syria would be to the different parties in Lebanon. So it's all unknown at the moment, but there is very little doubt that it will have a very big impact on not just Lebanon, but perhaps Lebanon more than other countries in the region.
Rami, thank you very much. I'll also mention to you, you can get country profiles on both Syria and Lebanon at bbc.com/news. We're seeing pictures there of protests. We know there have been big anti-Assad protests in Istanbul today and big pro-Assad protests in Damascus. We're going to take a break here on World Have Your Say. We'll be back in a couple of minutes' time to continue our conversations about Syria. I'm Ross Atkins. Thanks very much indeed for joining me on today's World Have Your Say. We're talking about Syria. It's been the biggest story in the world this week. We've got a number of guests to speak to live from Russia, from Cairo and from London. I'll introduce you to them properly in just a moment. First of all, let's pull up this message from Mordecai in New York, who's posted on facebook.com/World Have Your Say. He says, when has political pressure worked against a desperate, murderous leader without a real and credible threat of military intervention? I don't think it will be productive for the West to intervene. Turkey can and should. The time to act was yesterday. Well, Mordecai's in New York. Ben from the World Have Your Say team is in central London. Let's bring you in, Ben, to hear what people have been phoning in?
Well, I've just been trying to call someone back who phoned us from Bhutan. No success so far, but I'll keep you updated on that when we talk about Syria again on our radio programme at 1800 GMT. Also calls from Japan, lots from Nigeria and Malawi in the last 5-10 minutes. Lots of you wanting to talk specifically about the role of the Arab League in all of this. Ismail from Mauritius says the Arab world should help the regime to find a peaceful solution. But also some scepticism. Attila from Switzerland says the Arab League's not very trustworthy, so how can they tell the Syrian government what to do? And then also Meta in Canada says the Arab League, there's so much cruelty in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, according to her, it doesn't get the same coverage or the same focus.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben. A number of different points we can pick up with our three guests till the end of the programme. We have Pavel Felgenhauer, defence correspondent for Novaya Gazeta in Moscow. Good to have you on the programme. Ali Meir is a former Egyptian ambassador to a number of different countries and to the UN. And we also still have Rami here, the BBC's Arab Affairs analyst. Well, let's talk about the Arab League, because after all, Ali Meir, you worked there for a while. How do you assess how it has dealt with this crisis?
Well, I think the decisions taken by the Arab League on the Syrian crisis is unprecedented. The Arab League has taken such a strong position that is unheard for. And I think that the countries, the governments who are the doers in the Arab League understand very well that they cannot stop change. So President Assad, when he came to power 11 years ago, when he inherited from his father, was a young man open to modernity who had lived in a democratic surrounding, and he raised very high hopes that he would change, that would rectify the errors of his father. But unfortunately, 11 years ago, the people of Syria and the people of the area have discovered that he has not been able to do this. So the Arab League, for the first time, is taking the side of people against the government.
OK, so you highlight this as a turning point and a positive one. Pavel, what's your assessment of the Arab League?
Well, the Arab League indeed is acting more than it ever did before on Libya and now on Syria. This is changing, actually, to some extent, the playground and rules in the Middle East, surely. So this is some of a surprise.
And a last question, Rami, just quickly. If this 3-day deadline passes and President Assad doesn't do what he's asked to, what will happen?
Well, it's not clear what will happen. Perhaps more pressure, perhaps calling on the Security Council to intervene. However, just a very quick comment about the doers in the Arab League. The most aggressive have been the GCC, the Gulf countries, have been the most aggressive in pushing for more action on this. And it is very difficult to say that they are taking the side of the people. Obviously, there are many examples of them not taking the side of the people. Let me come in there,
Rami, because we're right out of time. Good to have you on the programme. Ali and Pavel, thank you very much indeed. We'll carry on this conversation online. Speak to you soon. Goodbye.
First here on the Hub, the party